Welcome back. Where had we left off? We had just started to talk about Huang Zunxian, an important Chinese poet and diplomat of the late 19th century of the Qing Dynasty. So, the Qing Dynasty was the last imperial dynasty of China. This is an interesting map, a Japanese map of the world from 1853, and it shows us China or the Qing Dynasty. The Qing was probably, one of the great dynasties in that Chinese territory was at its largest extent ever. And it was probably also one of the wealthiest. In fact, in the 19th century, in the early 19th century, Qing Dynasty is the richest, most powerful, and most populous nation or empire in the world. Now, while China conducts lucrative trade with Western powers, especially through the southern city of Canton or Guangzhou, the infamous Opium Wars, which I'm sure you've all heard about from your history classes in school, or maybe if you've taken a class with me before, 1839 to 1942 is the First Opium War, 1856 to 1860 the second one, tilt the trade balance in Europe's favor and really signal the beginning of Western imperialist ambitions in China. Here you have some images from the First Opium War, and I think especially the one on the right shows you what we've talked about earlier, right? Modernization, modernity, Western modernity. Steamships, Western arms technology was really what made it possible for a small country like Britain to beat China, that giant of Asia, in a war. Now, what is interesting is that the Opium War was actually just a minor war in terms of loss of life and even loss of territory. And most Chinese people at the time, didn't know that the war had been fought. However, the Opium Wars really signaled to progressive Chinese intellectuals like Huang Zunxian, like Li Hongzhao and some others, that China needed to modernize, needed to change to better face the challenges of the modern period. So in that respect, Huang Zunxian is really a man caught between two worlds, the old dynastic China and maybe a modern China that realizes that it needs to change, that it needs to adapt to the challenges of a changing world. So Huang Zunxian then, born 1848, a late Qing official, scholar, poet, and reformer. About 100 poems of his survive in a collection called Ren Jing Lu Shi Zao, poems from the hut amid the human realm. And I've actually put a link to the Chinese versions of the poems on iLearn. So, feel free to try to match those English translations with the Chinese poems. He was born into a Hakka family in southern China, in Guangdong province. His father already was Qing Dynasty official, but his family falls on hard times during the Taiping Rebellion, a terrible, terrible, terrible rebellion or civil war that devastated much of southern China, over that 14-year period, killed probably as many or maybe more than 20 million people, and almost brought the dynasty to an end. Huang Zunxian was traditionally trained. That means his schooling was all geared towards passing the civil service exams, which at that time was still really the only route into government service. And in 1877, he does pass the exams. Yet, while he was traditionally trained, he did realize that China needed to modernize. And, the Opium Wars and then that Taiping Rebellion really had been an eye-opening experience for him. So he becomes the assistant to He Ruzhang, an early ambassador to Japan, and he wrote a lot of poetry. During his stay in Japan, he also later wrote an important history of Japan, which was sort of a political/historical treatise about Japan. He later on actually also became the consul general in San Francisco, later traveled to London as well, and really was an important statesman and ambassador who really believed in the power of reform. Here's a quote from him that allegedly he uttered during an audience with the Guangxu Emperor: "The strength of Europe is entirely due to reforms. When I was in London, I heard the British gentlemen say that 100 years ago their government was still inferior to China, and yet by the late 19th century they ruled large parts of the world." Huang Zunxian in 1870, even before he had really joined the government service, he traveled to Hong Kong, which had been ceded to Great Britain after the First Opium Wars, and he wrote a poem about his visit to Hong Kong. "A foreign chief with curly hair, wealthy foreigners with blue eyes, round silver coins imprinted on them Queen Victoria. In the pagodas they honor Jesus. Fire trees glitter with silver petals, their felt fabric beautifully embroidered for sale in stores. After strong men developed the land, the city of desire, also a city of immortals." Very interesting poem in which he really engages with the material modernity he encounters in Hong Kong. He talks about the fire trees, which are probably lampposts. He talks about the trade and commerce, he sees them. He somewhat admires probably the British spirit of turning this barren land into this trading post, but probably also perceives the threat, right? The threat to China in that. Now, in China, poetry has traditionally been the most highly regarded form of literary expression, in part because it required mastery of very complex rules governing prosody. That is, rhyme, internal rhyme, that is, length of lines, and very important historical allusions. You know, essentially, you had to be familiar with a canon of Chinese poetry that, you know, went back 3,000 years. So to be good at poetry was always a sign of erudition. And, you know, I hate to say it, but some of that will be lost in translation. We'll read these in English, right? But there are some footnotes in the English translations that I provided, so they are somewhat useful. Now, Huang Zunxian revolutionized classical Chinese verse by infusing it with very contemporary themes, right? This idea of writing about Japan, writing about San Francisco, writing about all sorts of things, writing about modernity. And poetry really became the preferred medium through which Huang Zunxian and other reformers actually could reflect on the challenges of modernity and on, you know, the encounters with these foreign places he and others went to, right? Which is why I wanted him to be part of this class of travel literature, and which is probably why he's our starting point, because like few others, he really is that pivotal figure that connects, if you want, a pre-modern world with the modern world, right? That imperial dynastic China with really the late 19th, early 20th century. Now, meanwhile, Japan had reacted to the challenges posed by the West, by Western modernity, with the Meiji Restoration. Beginning in 1868, the old shogunate in Japan is overthrown. We have a new political regime. The emperor is reinstated, but more important, we have a constitutional monarchy, and we see a wholesale adoption of Western political and social institution. All of this, of course, had been triggered to some degree, if you want, right? You've probably learned that in your history classes as well, by Perry's visit to Japan in 1854, the famous black ships, right? We have that here on the right. Now, following the Meiji Restoration, Japan institutionalizes legal reforms based very much on the Napoleonic Code. Japanese went to Europe to study German and French institutions. It modernizes its military, advances its sciences. We will talk more about that next week when we talk about Muriogai. Builds up its industries. And as a result, Japan experiences rapid economic growth and witnesses an unprecedented population growth, which then eventually really would lead to Japan starting its own colonial expansionist project, and military conflict breaks out over control of Korea, later parts of China. But we'll talk more about that next week and in following weeks. Interestingly, Meiji Japan remains the preferred destination for Chinese reformers who want to study Western learning. So Japan really, as I said, embraces reform, studies a lot of Western technology, Western thought, and because of the proximity of the Chinese language and the Japanese written language, especially back then, Japan was still using a lot more Chinese characters, it was relatively easy for Chinese to master at least the Japanese script. And Japan really facilitated then the learning of, especially Western science and technology for Chinese reformers in Japan. So Huang Zunxian stays in Japan between 1877 and 1882. And I want you to read, of course, those poems, right? I want you to read all of those poems, and I want you to sort of think about what they tell us about Huang Zunxian, about the Chinese, their views of Japan, their views of the West, their views of this new modern age, maybe. Here is a snippet from one of the poems, A Song of Cherry Blossoms. But then giant waves surged eastward from foreign oceans, terrifying Japan's dragons, ghosts, Buddhas, and gods. The power of Europe grew stronger every day, overcoming the black slaves and the yellow race bit by bit. A poison fog of opium spread across the vast seas, but we closed off our country and slept like dead men. One day cannons roared from foreign men of war, rudely waking the people from sweet cherry blossom dreams. I have heard that the entrance of China's peach blossom paradise is completely concealed by shadowy clouds, and that its inhabitants know nothing of recent history. Very interesting. So much going on here, right? He comments on Japan's encounter with the West, those those strongmen from Europe and America. He talks about the poisonous fog of opium that clouded China, that was brought upon China by British mercantile activities and colonialism. It's a complex topic, but we'll probably be talking a little bit about the British East India Company and their activities. Despite everything, though, he does recognize that we closed off our country and slept like dead men, realizing that probably China should have woken up to that challenge earlier. So these poems, these classical style poems then, in many ways, I think are very modern in that they really comment on what's going on around him, even though they are embedded in, right, a lot of classical allusions. Here is an allusion to China's peach blossom paradise, a very, very famous Chinese legend that has been eulogized in a lot of poetry. But let's look at a couple of other poems that Huang Zunxian wrote while he was in Japan. Here's one about newspaper. If you want to know antiquity, read history books. If you want to know the present, then read the newspapers. They embody the thoughts of all schools of philosophy. The four corners of our world now speak this one language. Again, I think this is fascinating. He observes modern print capitalism, newspapers, and how newspapers, in a way, by spreading news from anywhere instantly, really connect readers globally, right? He's sort of impressed by this. Something that in 1870, China doesn't really have yet. China's first newspaper is set up by a British businessman in Shanghai, I think also around probably the 1880s. But still very much a modern thing, and Huang Zunxian writes about it in his poetry, something he encounters in Japan. By the way, at the bottom we have a woodblock print from Japan, probably from around that time, the 1870s, which of course really showcases the way Japan embraces modernity. You have this modern steel bridge, you have horse-drawn wagons, you have people wearing Western dress, and of course in the background you have Tokyo, you have Edo, right? You see those pagodas and those buildings. Here are a couple more very interesting poems. Japanese-style public baths. Spotted bamboo curtains half rolled up. Gauze windows wide open. A riot of hairbands and bath towels covering heads and breasts. You would think you had entered a lotus pond in Buddha's paradise. So why shouldn't heavenly damsels scatter flower petals on the ground? A lot of visitors to Japan, especially Chinese visitors, but also actually European visitors, observed, the way public baths functioned in Japan, and that there often was not even a separation between gender, and that the Japanese were in a way a lot less prudish about their bodies, certainly than the Qing Dynasty was, or Victorian Britain, say. So this is, I think, really interesting that he writes about that. By the way, the photographs are by another very famous traveler, Felice Beato, an Italian-British photographer who traveled to Asia, East Asia and South Asia around that time in the 1860s, 1870s. And he captured Japan, China, India at that moment in time, the very, very early days of photography. Of course, it was still black and white. These colors were probably added later. Another poem here, Foreign Imports. They display cashmere carpets with 1,000-hued flowers, drink 100 cups of sparkling wine from the Western paradise. They will bankrupt themselves buying all these foreign baubles, but thank heavens they're not addicted to opium like us. Very interesting. Again, he observes these new patterns of consumerism in Japan that we see in Meiji Japan in the 1870s, 1880s. That woodblock print on the right, again, is probably testimony to that. I think this is Ginza, the main shopping street in Tokyo. You have these horse-drawn trams, people out there shopping. You have Western-style buildings already in the background. He talks about people drinking champagne, right? Imported from France, sparkling wine, and how expensive it is that it will bankrupt them. However, he again also observes that Japan, unlike China, has not fallen, if you want, under the same imperialist oppression as China has, having opium forced upon them by the British, right? So very interesting. These poems then are both, observations of what he sees in Japan. To some degree, they are political commentary, both on Japan and on China, and I think they tell us something about his political views, right? So very interesting how travel literature then can essentially inform our own political views just because we see other countries, we see our own country probably through a new lens. So this then again leads us to these questions that we want to ask ourselves as we read through these poems. To what degree are these poems a product really of the language and the culture that produced them, i.e. late 19th century China? What kind of image do they project of Japan? What larger socio-historic phenomenon is this work responding to, right? In a way, of course, we've already seen that they do respond to the Opium Wars, that they do respond to imperialism, they do respond to modernization. And again, do they tell us something about what Huang Zunxian was looking for in Tokyo in 1877? Why did he write this poetry? What else did he write about? What kind of image does he leave us with of Tokyo and of Japan? And very interesting, how do we, as 21st century travelers, react to Huang's account? Do we recognize Japan? Do we recognize the Japan he's describing? Any of these observations I would love to see in your reading responses. And of course, in this week's quiz, you will see there will always be one question in the quiz that will be somewhat reflective, in which I would like you to comment a little bit about the readings. Less detailed than in your reading response, but still, there is going to be some reflection. So please reflect these questions and I look forward to seeing you again next week.